Hi, my name is Grace Nickel, and today I'm going to be talking about the one-act play Trifles, written by Susan Glaspell. So, what is Trifles? Trifles is a one-act play that was written by Susan Glaspell in 1916. The whole play is pretty much about Minnie Wright, who was arrested for the murder of her husband. And another thing that you want to keep in mind throughout this play is that the society of the play based their roles in life on their gender. It was very much a male-dominated society. The women did not have many roles or rights within the society other than staying in their houses all day long and cooking and cleaning and providing for their husbands. So my thesis is that the community failed to support Minnie Wright with her struggles through social oppression of women, the blindness of men, and isolation. So my first main point that I'm going to talk about is the social oppression of women that is found in the play Trifles. So since the men dominated the society, it led to them treating the women very unfairly. The men would constantly be belittling the women by mocking their character and intelligence, making them feel very unworthy in a way. The men would also constantly make jokes and laugh at the women for their emphasis on trifles, and that essentially was the small needs of housekeeping and comfort, which was all that the women were allowed to do in the society. Another thing to keep in mind is that all of the women within this play were only known by their husbands' last names. For example, Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale. We never knew their first name because they were only known by their husbands' last names. But the only female character who went by their name was Minnie, which was also the only female character that went against the norms of society by breaking character of a quote-unquote woman of the time. So my evidence for social oppression of women was a conversation between Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale. They say it was such a funny way to kill a man, rigging it all up like that. That's just what Mr. Hale said. There was a gun in the house. He says that's what he can't understand. And this can be found on pages 67 and 68. So how does this quote relate to my findings? This quote shows that the men didn't think that any woman was essentially capable of killing a man. They thought that the only thing women were good for was cooking and cleaning, and then not one of them had the thought that a woman could actually go out and kill a man. My second topic is the blindness of men. So after the murder, obviously the men decided to undergo the investigation, but they missed out on a lot of key details because they only really focused on the bigger picture, while Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters were able to uncover lots of evidence that the men did not, because they noticed the smaller things that only women would notice. Since they walked the shoes of Minnie Wright by also being other wives who would work in the houses all day long, they noticed things that other men would not. So, due to the fact that the men think of themselves as all high and mighty, they do not think that they are doing anything wrong in life. They think that everything that they do is perfect and that they are just the best thing to walk planet Earth, which leads to the husbands not even noticing the torture and the pain that they put their wives through by belittling them, making fun of them, whenever all that the women do is provide for their husbands. So, my evidence for the blindness of men was a conversation between George Henderson and Mrs. Hale. Well, Henry, at least we found out that she was not going to quilt it. She was going to, what is it you call it, ladies? We call it knot it, Mr. Henderson. And this can be found on pages 150 and 151. So how does this quote relate to my findings of the blindness of men? This quote provides an actual prime example of how men do not pay enough attention to the women and all that they do. Since the men are only focused on themselves and what other men have, they're not going to focus on the little things that the women do around the household, and it just shows that they don't pay them enough attention and are unable to be appreciative for all that the women do. My last topic is isolation. So the society that Trifles takes place in isolates the women from the rest of the world, since they're trapped in their houses all day long, only cooking and cleaning. And by being isolated, the women are left with little to no happiness. It states that the only happiness that Minnie had was her pet canary, which was quickly taken away from her due to her husband, which which was the main point that really set Minnie over the edge, which after her pet canary being strangled and being dead now, she was left with absolutely no happiness because her husband brought zero happiness to her in her life. And the society was very unaware of the isolation that they put the woman in. They would only see, and that is something that they would only see if someone went against the grain. But not only does this play focus on the isolation of Minnie and the rest of the women in this society, it also shows the isolation of all human beings because the way that the society was formed. My evidence for isolation was right off the bat in page 1, the very first sentence, and it says, "In the now abandoned farmhouse of John Wright, a gloomy kitchen." So how does this quote relate to my findings? Like I said, right off the bat in the beginning, it sets a play in an abandoned house, which essentially leads to the idea of isolation. When you hear the word abandoned, you think of loneliness and nobody being there, and it's just a very isolated place. My conclusion. I believe that the purpose of this play was to not underestimate the women of a society. At the time, this play was written in 1916, and the women of this time were not treated equally by the men. Like I said in the beginning, they had no rights and no roles in their society. My final thoughts on Trifles. So, overall, the community did fail in supporting Minnie Wright and all her struggles between the social oppression of women and the blindness of men and isolation. Another thing that stuck out to me was the fact how Minnie changed after marriage. Before she was married, it said that she was a very bright and happy woman who would sing all the time. And afterwards, she quit singing and she became a very cold and quiet person. She essentially became someone who she was not. And she didn't like that version of herself. And unlike the rest of the women, Minnie went against the norms of society and did something about her problems, which was unheard of for the time of it being 1916. And in return, she got no support from her community whatsoever. So there are my references. Thank you.